Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you grateful for modern medicine in ways you've never considered. We're diving into medieval childbirth, but not the romanticised version where women give birth in clean beds surrounded by wise healers. We're talking about the brutal reality where pregnancy wasn't just a blessing, it was a gamble with death. The leading cause of mortality for women wasn't disease, wasn't famine, wasn't even war. It was the act of bringing life into the world, and the statistics are staggering. If you were a woman of childbearing age in medieval Europe, your greatest fear wasn't plague or invasion, it was pregnancy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself as a woman in medieval Europe. You're 20 years old, recently married, and you've just realised you're pregnant. In the modern world, this might be a moment of joy, of planning, of prenatal vitamins and doctor's appointments. But in 1250, this realisation comes with a very different emotion. Fear. Cold, gripping fear. Because you know the numbers. Everyone knows the numbers. 1 in 3 women in your village has died in childbirth. Maybe it was your older sister. Maybe it was your mother. Maybe it was the woman next door whose screams you heard through the walls before they suddenly, terrifyingly stopped. You know that pregnancy isn't just about having a baby. It's about survival. And the odds aren't in your favour. Let's talk about those numbers, because they're worse than most people realise. In medieval Europe, maternal mortality rates range from 10 to 30%. That's not a typo. Depending on where you lived, your social class and pure luck, you had between a 1 in 10 and a 1 in 3 chance of dying from pregnancy or childbirth-related complications. To put that in perspective, modern maternal mortality in developed countries is about 0.02%. Medieval women were 500 to 1,500 times more likely to die from childbirth than women today. 500 times. Let that sink in for a moment. But those statistics don't tell the whole story, because those numbers only account for deaths directly during or immediately after birth. They don't count the women who died from infections weeks later. They don't count the women who survived childbirth but died from complications months afterward. They don't count the women whose bodies were so damaged by repeated pregnancies that they died young from organ failure, from prolapsed uteruses, from fistulas that caused constant pain and infection. If you include all pregnancy-related deaths, some historians estimate that up to 40% of medieval women died from complications related to childbirth over their lifetimes. Think about what that means. If you were a medieval woman, you had a better chance of dying from pregnancy than a medieval soldier had of dying in battle. War was dangerous, yes, but it was intermittent. Pregnancy was a recurring threat that came back again and again and again, and you couldn't avoid it. If you were married, pregnancy was expected. It was your duty, your purpose, the entire reason for your existence, according to medieval society. You couldn't opt out. You couldn't decide you'd had enough children. You couldn't say no. Your body wasn't yours. It belonged to your husband, to your family, to the continuation of the bloodline. And so you got pregnant. Again and again. Until your body gave out or you got lucky enough to reach menopause. The average medieval woman who survived to adulthood had 5 to 7 pregnancies. But remember, that's an average. Some women had 15, 16, even 20 pregnancies. Queen Anne of England, though slightly later in the early 1700s, had 17 pregnancies. Only 5 resulted in live births, and none of those children survived past age 11. 17 times she went through pregnancy and childbirth. 17 times she risked death. And in the end, all she had to show for it was trauma, physical damage, and a dynasty that ended with her death because she had no surviving heirs. Medieval women knew these risks. They weren't naive. They saw their friends die. They saw their sisters die. They attended births that went wrong, that turned from joyful anticipation to screaming agony, to sudden, horrifying silence. And yet they had no choice but to face it again and again. There was no birth control, no family planning, no let's wait a few years. If you were married, you were expected to produce children, immediately, constantly, until you died, or your body could no longer conceive. And the church made it worse. The medieval Catholic Church taught that sex was only permissible within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation. Using any method to prevent pregnancy was a sin, a serious sin. Women who tried to control their fertility through herbal remedies or timing methods were viewed with suspicion. Some were even accused of witchcraft. The church wanted women pregnant. It wanted large families. It wanted the population to grow, and it didn't particularly care how many women died in the process. Women's bodies were tools for reproduction. Their lives were secondary to the lives of the babies they might produce. So when a medieval woman discovered she was pregnant, she knew she was entering a period of danger that would last not 9 months, but closer to a year when you include the postpartum period. And she knew that her chances of dying were higher than most modern people face in their entire lives. She would often put her affairs in order, write a will if she was wealthy enough to have property, say goodbye to her other children, make peace with God, because pregnancy was a death sentence that might or might not be carried out. And there was no way to know until it was over whether you'd be one of the lucky ones who survived or one of the many who didn't. Now let's talk about what actually happened when it was time to give birth. Because the process itself was designed, it seems, to maximize suffering and death. There were no hospitals, no sterile environments, no medical professionals who actually understood anatomy. Just you, a midwife whose training consisted of watching other births, a room full of women from your family and community, and pain beyond anything you'd ever experienced. When your contractions began, you were taken to a birthing room. This was usually the darkest, warmest room in the house. Windows were sealed shut, doors were closed. The medieval belief was that fresh air was dangerous for labouring women, that it would let in evil spirits or cause illness. So you laboured in a hot, stuffy, airless room. The lack of ventilation meant the room quickly became filled with the smell of sweat, blood, amniotic fluid, and fear. If you were wealthy, you might have a birthing chair, a specially designed seat with a hole in the middle that allowed the baby to drop through. If you were poor, you squatted on the floor or knelt on hay. The midwife was your only medical support, and while some midwives were experienced and skilled, they had no understanding of infection, no concept of hygiene, no training in anatomy. They didn't wash their hands. They didn't sterilize their tools. They didn't know that the same hands that had just delivered a dead baby from a woman with childbed fever could transmit that fever to you. Cross-contamination killed countless women, but nobody knew. Germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 500 years. Your labour might last hours. It might last days. There was no way to monitor the baby's heartbeat, no way to check if the baby was in distress, no way to perform a safe caesarean section. If the baby was positioned wrong, if it was breech or sideways, you were in serious trouble. The midwife might try to turn the baby manually, reaching inside you with unwashed hands, tearing delicate tissue, introducing infection. The pain was unimaginable. Women screamed themselves hoarse. Some passed out from the agony, some bit through leather straps or pieces of wood placed in their mouths to keep them from breaking their teeth. And there was no pain relief, none, no epidural, no gas and air, no morphine, nothing. Some wealthy women might be given wine or ale to dull the edge slightly. Some might be given herbal preparations, tinctures of poppy or mandrake that could ease pain, but could also slow labour dangerously or poison the mother. But most women faced the full force of labour pain with nothing but prayer and the support of other women who had been through the same ordeal. The medieval church taught that labour pain was God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Pain in childbirth was divinely ordained. It was your punishment for being a woman. Some theologians even argued that attempting to reduce labour pain was a sin, that women should suffer as Eve had suffered, that pain was spiritually purifying. So you suffered, and suffered, and suffered, For hours or days, your body tearing itself apart trying to push a human being out of an opening that seemed impossibly small. If things went normally, if the baby was positioned correctly, if you were strong enough, eventually the baby would be born. The midwife would cut the umbilical cord with a knife that had probably been used for a dozen other purposes and hadn't been cleaned. She'd deliver the placenta, check to make sure it was intact because everyone knew that retained placental tissue caused deadly infections, though they didn't know why. You'd be cleaned up, the baby would be cleaned, and everyone would breathe a sigh of relief. You'd survived, for now. But if things didn't go normally, if the baby was stuck, if it was too large, if your pelvis was too narrow, then the nightmare really began. The midwife would try everything she knew. She'd have you change positions. She'd give you herbal preparations to strengthen contractions. She'd reach inside you trying to pull the baby out manually. She'd pray. The other women would pray. Everyone would pray. Because at this point, prayer was all that was left. Sometimes the baby would die in the womb during a prolonged labour. Sometimes it would die during the birth process itself. And if a dead baby couldn't be delivered, it would decay inside you, poisoning your blood, killing you slowly and agonizingly over days. Some midwives, in desperation, would use hooks to pull out a dead baby piece by piece. They'd reach inside you with metal instruments and literally dismember the infant to save your life. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the physical agony, the emotional trauma, feeling your dead child being torn apart inside you? And this was considered a success if you survived. The baby was dead either way. At least this way you might live. But often you didn't live. Often the trauma was too much. The bleeding was too severe. The infection set in too quickly. And you died. Sometimes within hours of the birth going wrong. Sometimes over days of agony as your body slowly shut down. Your family would watch you fade. Your other children would be brought in to say goodbye. A priest would be called to give you last rites. And you would die, often not yet 25 years old, leaving behind a grieving husband, motherless children, and a community that would shake their heads sadly and say it was God's will. When a medieval woman died in childbirth, it wasn't like a death in a hospital today where the body is cleaned, prepared, made to look peaceful. You died in a mess of blood and fluids. You died in pain. You died often with your eyes open, frozen in fear or agony. Your body would be cleaned by the same women who had attended the birth, many of them traumatized by what they'd witnessed. They'd wash the blood away, they'd close your eyes, they'd dress you in a clean shift, and they'd prepare you for burial. Burial usually happened quickly, within a day or two at most. Bodies decomposed faster without modern preservation, and the smell would become unbearable, especially in summer. If you were wealthy, you might be buried in a church cemetery, maybe even inside the church itself. A priest would say prayers for your soul. Your family would mourn. If you were poor, you'd be buried in the village cemetery in an unmarked grave, or a grave marked with a simple wooden cross that would rot away within a few years. Either way, your life was over, cut short by the very act of creating life. And what happened to the baby? If the baby had died too, it would usually be buried with you, tucked into your arms so that in death at least, you could hold the child you died trying to bring into the world. Some churches had special burial grounds for stillborn babies and infants who died before baptism. These babies were in spiritual limbo according to church teaching, their souls neither in heaven nor hell but in a place called limbo, where they would remain for eternity. Parents were told they'd never see these children again, not even in the afterlife. It was one more cruelty piled onto an already unbearable situation. If the baby survived but you didn't, your baby faced a difficult future. Newborns needed milk, constantly. And in a world without formula, without bottles, without any alternative to breast milk, a motherless baby was in serious danger. If you were wealthy, your husband would immediately hire a wet nurse, another woman who was currently breastfeeding and could take on your baby as well. Wet nurses were common in medieval society. Many were women who had lost their own babies and needed the income. Others were simply poor women with abundant milk who could feed multiple babies. Your baby might survive if a wet nurse could be found quickly enough, But wet nursing came with its own risks. Some wet nurses were neglectful, some had diseases, some didn't have enough milk for multiple babies, and babies were fragile. Even with the best wet nurse, your baby might die within weeks of your death. If you were poor, the situation was even more desperate. Your husband would frantically search for a woman in the village who was nursing and might be willing to feed your baby. Maybe a sister, maybe a neighbour, maybe a charitable woman who took pity on a motherless infant. But poor women couldn't necessarily afford to feed another mouth. They had their own children to worry about. And so some motherless babies simply starved to death, slowly, painfully, over days or weeks. They'd cry and cry until they were too weak to cry, and then they'd die, joining their mothers in the churchyard. Some husbands, desperate to save their newborns, would try feeding them animal milk, goat milk, cow milk, sheep milk. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Animal milk didn't have the right nutritional balance for human infants. It lacked the antibodies found in human breast milk. Babies fed on animal milk often developed digestive issues, failed to thrive, succumbed to infections. But it was better than watching your child starve. So fathers tried and prayed, and sometimes buried their babies next to their wives. The grief of losing a wife in childbirth was real. Some historical records show husbands genuinely mourning their wives, writing letters about their sorrow, endowing masses for their souls, visiting their graves. But the economic reality of medieval life meant that grieving had to be brief. If you were a man with young children and your wife had just died, you needed help. You needed someone to care for the children, to cook, to clean, to manage the household. You needed a wife. And so most widowers remarried quickly, very quickly, sometimes within weeks of their first wife's death. It wasn't necessarily callousness, it was survival. A household needed a woman to function, children needed a mother figure, and if your first wife had died without giving you a male heir, you needed to try again with a new wife. For the dead woman, this was another indignity. To be replaced so quickly, to have another woman sleeping in your bed, caring for your children, taking your place as if you'd never existed. Some men married their wife's sisters, keeping it in the family. Some married servants or neighbours. Some remarried women who themselves were widows, creating blended families of children who'd lost mothers and fathers to various medieval dangers. Life went on. It had to. But the cruelty of how quickly women were forgotten, how easily replaced they were, speaks to the medieval view of women as functional objects rather than irreplaceable individuals. And what about the children who lost their mothers? The ones old enough to remember her? They were expected to accept their new stepmother without complaint, to call her mother, to obey her. Medieval childhood didn't allow for extended grief or psychological processing. Children who cried too much were disciplined. Children who rejected their stepmothers were punished. The fairy tale trope of the wicked stepmother has some basis in reality. Some stepmothers favoured their own children over their stepchildren. Some were resentful of having to raise another woman's children. Some were cruel. But many were simply overwhelmed, thrust into households with children who hated them, expected to replace a woman they'd never met, blamed for not being the mother who died. The trauma of losing a mother in childbirth rippled through families for generations. But medieval society didn't acknowledge trauma. It didn't have words for PTSD or grief counselling. You suffered, you endured, you moved on. Because what choice did you have? Now let's talk about something that might seem counterintuitive. You'd think that after seeing the dangers of childbirth, after losing mothers, sisters, friends, medieval women would try to limit their pregnancies, would space out their children, would do anything to reduce the number of times they had to risk death. But that's not what happened. Instead, most women faced constant pressure to have more children. More. Always more. Even if it killed them, and everyone knew it might. Why? Why would a society that watched women die in droves from childbirth continue to push women into pregnancy after pregnancy? The answer is complicated, rooted in medieval economics, religion, and the fundamental view of women as reproductive vessels rather than human beings with a right to life and health. First, infant and child mortality was staggering. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50% of children died before age 5. That's half of all children born. They died from disease, from accidents, from malnutrition, from infections, from causes we can't even identify now. So if you wanted to ensure that at least some of your children survived to adulthood, you needed to have many children. It was a numbers game. Have 10 children, maybe 5 would reach adulthood. Have 5 children, maybe 2 or 3 would make it. Medieval people understood this arithmetic viscerally. Every family had buried children. Every mother knew that the baby she was currently nursing might be dead by next winter. So the pressure was to keep having babies to replace the ones who would inevitably die. Second, children were economic assets. On farms, which is where most medieval people lived, children were labour. By age 5 or 6, children could help with simple tasks. By age 10, they could do significant work. By their teens, they were nearly as productive as adults. More children meant more hands to work the fields, tend the animals, help with the endless manual labour that medieval life required. And in old age, your children were your retirement plan. There were no pensions, no social security. If you lived long enough to become too old or infirm to work, you depended on your adult children to care for you. No children meant dying alone in poverty. So having many children wasn't just about continuing the family line, it was about survival. Third, for noble families, children were political currency. Daughters could be married off to create alliances with other families. Sons could inherit titles, lands, armies. But child mortality affected nobles just as much as peasants. Maybe more, since noble women often married very young, while their bodies were still developing, and had pregnancy after pregnancy in rapid succession. So noble families needed to produce many children to ensure the succession. A king with only one son lived in fear of that son dying and throwing the kingdom into chaos. Better to have 5 sons. Then if 2 died in childhood, 1 in battle, and 1 from disease, you'd still have an heir. The church, as mentioned, actively discouraged any form of birth control, but it went further than that. The church taught that women were inherently sinful, that they were weak and corruptible, that their only redemption was through motherhood. A woman who refused to have children, who tried to avoid pregnancy, was rejecting her God-given purpose. She was selfish, sinful, possibly in league with the devil. The ideal medieval woman was Mary, the mother of Jesus. Eternally virgin yet eternally mother, pure yet fertile, an impossible standard that nevertheless shaped how society viewed women. Your value was in your womb. Your purpose was to suffer through pregnancy and childbirth as many times as possible. Dying in the process was tragic but acceptable, even noble. You died fulfilling your purpose. What more could be asked of a woman? So women got pregnant, again and again. Some women in the historical record had pregnancies almost annually for their entire fertile years. Imagine that. Imagine spending 25 years of your life almost constantly pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Your body never fully healing from the last birth before the next pregnancy began. Your organs, your bones, your muscles, never getting a chance to recover. Each pregnancy taking a little more from you, weakening you further, making the next birth even more dangerous, and nobody cared. Or rather, the care was abstract. People would say things like God's will or a woman's lot. They'd acknowledge that childbirth was dangerous, but they'd also shrug and say what else could be done. Women were made for this. It was their purpose. If they died, well, that was unfortunate but not unexpected. Another woman would take their place. The cycle would continue. Some women, knowing they were likely to die in a future childbirth, would try folk methods of birth control, herbal preparations that might prevent pregnancy or cause early miscarriage, pessaries made of various materials inserted to block conception, timing methods based on the phases of the moon or other observations. But these methods were unreliable at best, dangerous at worst, and if a woman was discovered using them, She faced serious consequences: social ostracism, accusations of witchcraft, even death in extreme cases. So most women simply endured, pregnancy after pregnancy, birth after birth, until they died or reached menopause. And reaching menopause was a victory. You'd survived. You'd beaten the odds. Your body was finally your own again. But the trauma never left. Women who'd had 10 pregnancies and lost half their children carried that grief forever. Women whose bodies had been damaged by repeated births lived with constant pain, with incontinence from fistulas, with prolapsed organs, with complications that medieval medicine couldn't treat and could barely understand. They were the walking wounded of a war that nobody acknowledged was being fought, a war against women's bodies in the name of procreation. Let's talk about one of the most terrifying aspects of medieval childbirth: the infections. Because even if you survived the birth itself, even if the baby was delivered successfully and you didn't hemorrhage to death, you still faced weeks of danger from infections that could kill you just as surely as a difficult labour. The most feared was childbed fever, known medically as puerperal fever, and it killed thousands upon thousands of women in the medieval period and beyond. Childbed fever set in usually within the first week after birth. You'd start to feel unwell, feverish, weak. You'd have chills, pain in your abdomen, a foul-smelling discharge from your vagina. At first, you might think it was just normal post-birth discomfort. The midwife might tell you it was your body adjusting. But then the fever would spike. You'd become delirious. The pain would intensify. And within days, sometimes within hours, you'd be dead, killed by an infection that antibiotics could cure in the modern world. But in the medieval period, there was no cure. Nothing could be done except prayer and watching you die. What caused childbed fever? We know now it was usually a bacterial infection, often group A streptococcus, that entered the uterus during or after childbirth. The bacteria multiplied in the perfect breeding ground of post-birth tissue, blood and fluids. They entered the bloodstream, they caused sepsis, and they killed. But medieval people didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about infection. They attributed childbed fever to bad air, to humoral imbalances, to God's judgment, to witchcraft. They tried treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful, bleeding the patient to balance her humours, giving her concoctions of herbs, placing holy relics near her bed. Nothing worked. Because the actual cause, bacteria introduced by unwashed hands and unsterilised tools, was never addressed. Midwives moved from patient to patient without washing their hands. They'd deliver a baby from a woman with childbed fever, then go directly to another labouring woman, carrying the bacteria with them. They didn't know they were spreading death. They thought they were helping. And so the infection passed from woman to woman, from birth to birth, an invisible killer that nobody understood. And the death from childbed fever was agonizing. As the infection spread through your body, as your organs began to fail, you'd experience excruciating pain. Your abdomen would swell, you'd vomit, you'd have diarrhea, you'd be consumed by fever, burning up from the inside. Your family would watch helplessly. The midwife would try her remedies, growing more desperate as nothing worked. A priest would be called. You'd confess your sins, receive communion, be anointed with holy oil, and then you'd die, often screaming, often begging for it to end. Your body would be examined after death, and people would shake their heads and say it was God's will or bad luck, or perhaps you'd been cursed. The tragedy is that childbed fever was largely preventable. Not completely, not with medieval technology, but significantly. If midwives had washed their hands between patients, if tools had been cleaned, if basic hygiene had been practiced. But the connection between cleanliness and infection wouldn't be understood until the 1800s, when doctors like Ignaz Semmelweis finally proved the link. And even then, many doctors refused to believe that they could be spreading disease. The ego of thinking, my hands are clean, I'm a professional, killed patients for decades even after the evidence was clear. In the medieval period, nobody even suspected. And so, women died. Other infections were common too. Infections from tears in the vaginal or perineal tissue. Infections from retained placental tissue. Infections from the umbilical stump if the baby had been placed against the mother's skin before the cord was properly tied off. Infections from well-meaning attempts to clean the mother after birth using contaminated water or cloths. Every point where the body was open or wounded was a potential entry point for bacteria. And in a world without antibiotics, even a minor infection could become deadly. Some women developed abscesses, pockets of pus and infected tissue that grew larger and more painful until they ruptured, either inward causing sepsis or outward creating open wounds that never healed properly. Some women developed fistulas, abnormal connections between organs caused by prolonged labour. A vesicovaginal fistula, a connection between the bladder and vagina, would cause constant leakage of urine. The woman would smell constantly of urine no matter how often she washed. She'd be socially ostracised. Her husband might abandon her. And there was no surgical fix in medieval times. She'd live with it until she died, often from infections related to the constant wetness and irritation. Rectovaginal fistulas were even worse. A connection between the rectum and vagina meant fecal matter would leak constantly. The smell was unbearable. The infections were constant. The social isolation was complete. Some women in this situation were essentially imprisoned in their homes, too ashamed to be seen in public, too disgusting to others to be welcomed anywhere. Their lives became an endless nightmare of pain, smell, and loneliness. All because of damage during childbirth that could have been prevented with proper medical knowledge. And remember, women face these risks not once but repeatedly. If you survived your first birth, you'd likely face pregnancy again within a year or two. Each pregnancy brought the same risks. Each birth was another roll of the dice. Would this be the one that killed you, or would you be lucky again? The psychological toll was immense. Modern women who've had traumatic births often develop PTSD, anxiety, tocophobia, the fear of childbirth. Medieval women felt the same fear but had no words for it, no treatment, no acknowledgement that their terror was valid and reasonable. They'd become pregnant and immediately begin preparing for death, writing wills, saying goodbyes. Some women refused to bond with their unborn babies, trying to protect themselves emotionally in case the baby died or they died. Some became depressed during pregnancy, what we'd now call prenatal depression, but was then seen as a spiritual failing or a sign of weak character. Some prayed constantly, bargaining with God. Let me survive this one and I'll never complain again. But God didn't bargain. The next pregnancy would come, and the next. Until finally, for many women, the odds caught up with them, and they died. Now let's talk about something medieval people understood very well. Wealth didn't protect you from death in childbirth. Oh, it helped in some ways. Wealthy women had better nutrition, which meant they were generally healthier going into pregnancy. They didn't have to work in the fields while pregnant. They had servants to do the heavy labour. They could rest more. But when it came to the actual birth, when it came to the moment of truth, being rich or noble didn't save you. Queens died in childbirth just as often as peasants. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, that no amount of money or power could protect you from this particular danger. Take Queen Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII of England. Jane finally gave Henry what he desperately wanted, a legitimate male heir, Prince Edward. But 12 days after the birth, Jane died. The official records say she died of childbed fever. She'd done her duty, she'd given the king his son, and her reward was death. She was in her late 20s, she had access to the best midwives in England. She was in a palace, not a hovel. She had every advantage medieval medicine could provide, and none of it mattered. The infection took her anyway. Or consider Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Catherine had multiple pregnancies. Most ended in stillbirth or the death of the infant shortly after birth. She had at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child, Princess Mary, survived to adulthood. Think about that. A queen. the daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, married to the King of England, with access to every resource, and she lost 5 of 6 pregnancies. The physical toll on her body must have been devastating. And when she couldn't produce a male heir, when her body finally failed to carry another pregnancy, Henry divorced her and triggered the English Reformation. Her value as a woman was measured entirely by her ability to produce children. When she couldn't, she was discarded. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, survived him. But she'd been married before to men who died, and after Henry's death she married again and became pregnant for the first time in her late 30s. She gave birth to a daughter, and 6 days later she died of childbed fever. Educated, wealthy, the widow of a king, dead from the same infection that killed peasant women in dirty hovels. Anne of Brittany, Queen of France, had 14 pregnancies. Only 2 children, both daughters, survived to adulthood. 14 times she risked death. 12 times she lost the baby, either during pregnancy, at birth, or in early infancy. The grief alone would be unbearable, but she kept trying because that was her duty. She eventually died at age 36 from what was likely complications from her final pregnancy. Isabel of Castile, the mother of the famous Isabella who sponsored Columbus, died in childbirth. So did Isabella of Aragon, Queen of Portugal, and Margaret of York, and countless other noble and royal women whose names we don't even know because they died young before they could make their mark on history. Their footnotes. Died in childbirth. 3 words that ended so many lives. Even with the best food, the best rest, the best care medieval society could provide, noblewomen died. Because the fundamental problems couldn't be solved with money. They didn't have the medical knowledge. They didn't have sterile environments. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have blood transfusions or surgical interventions. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII of England, gave birth to him when she was 13 years old. 13. Her body was so damaged by the birth that she never had another child despite multiple marriages. She survived, barely, but her reproductive years were over at 13, and she was lucky. Many girls that young died in their first childbirth. Their bodies simply couldn't do it. Wealthy women also faced something poor women didn't. Pressure to produce male heirs. A peasant woman who had only daughters wasn't ideal, but it wasn't a political crisis. A queen who failed to produce sons could be divorced, cast aside, even executed. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was beheaded partly because she couldn't give Henry a son. She'd had one daughter, Elizabeth, and then multiple miscarriages. Henry wanted a son. Anne's inability to provide one sealed her fate. So wealthy women carried not just the physical burden of pregnancy, but the enormous political and personal pressure of their baby's sex. Something they had no control over, but would be blamed for nevertheless. And when wealthy women died in childbirth, the impact rippled through politics and history. Succession crises, wars, dynasties ending. The death of a queen in childbirth wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a political earthquake, and yet it kept happening, because nobody could prevent it. All the wealth and power in the world couldn't save you if the baby was positioned wrong or an infection set in. So poor women looked at queens dying in childbirth and felt a grim solidarity. It could happen to anyone, would happen to many, and no one was safe. Let's talk about the midwives, the women who attended births, because they occupy a complicated position in this story. They were trying to help. They wanted women to survive. They passed down knowledge from generation to generation about positioning, about herbal remedies, about techniques that sometimes worked. But they were also operating in complete ignorance of actual anatomy and physiology. They believed things that were actively harmful, and their lack of knowledge, their superstitions, their well-meaning but useless interventions contributed to the death toll. Midwives learned through apprenticeship. You became a midwife by attending births with an experienced midwife, watching, helping, eventually taking the lead yourself. There were no textbooks, no formal education, no understanding of the underlying biological processes. You learned what you saw, and what you saw was often births going wrong in ways nobody understood. So you developed explanations, and those explanations became tradition, and tradition became unquestioned truth even when it was completely wrong. For example, many midwives believed that the mother's emotional state affected the birth. If you were frightened or upset, labour would be harder, so midwives tried to keep labouring women calm. Calm is good, right? Except when it led to midwives scolding women for screaming, for expressing pain, for being hysterical. Some women were told to be quiet, to endure in silence, that making noise would make the birth harder. Imagine being told to suffer quietly while your body tears itself apart. The psychological damage on top of the physical trauma. Midwives also had various techniques for speeding up labour if it seemed to be going too slowly. Some of these involved giving the mother herbal concoctions that were supposed to strengthen contractions. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, was sometimes used. And yes, ergot does cause uterine contractions. It's actually where we get modern labour-inducing drugs. But in uncontrolled doses, ergot could cause contractions so strong they ruptured the uterus. It could cut off blood flow to the baby. It could cause hallucinations and gangrene in the mother, but midwives didn't know the dosage. They'd give what they thought was right and hope. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it killed. Other techniques involved physical manipulation, massaging the belly to try to position the baby, reaching inside to manually turn a baby. These could work if the midwife was skilled and lucky, but they could also cause tearing, introduce infection, harm the baby, or simply fail to solve the problem. And if the midwife's hands weren't clean, which they never were, infection was almost guaranteed. If a birth was going very wrong, if the baby seemed stuck and the mother was failing, some midwives would try extreme measures, hooks to pull the baby out, sharp instruments to cut the baby inside the womb to make it smaller. These were last-ditch efforts. They usually meant the baby died, but the goal was to save the mother. Sometimes it worked. Often the mother died anyway from the trauma and infection. But midwives tried because what else could they do? Watching a woman and baby die without attempting anything felt wrong, so they attempted, and sometimes created more harm. Midwives also had superstitious practices. They'd recite prayers or charms during the birth, place holy relics near the mother, use amulets and talismans, perform rituals that were supposed to make the birth easier. None of this had any medical value, but it gave the mother and the midwife something to believe in, a sense that they weren't completely helpless, that maybe God or the saints would intervene. Sometimes the psychological comfort was valuable, even if the practice was useless. The church had complicated feelings about midwives. On one hand, midwives performed a necessary function. On the other hand, they were women with specialized knowledge, which made the church suspicious. Midwives knew about herbs that could cause miscarriage. They knew about ways to prevent pregnancy. This knowledge was dangerous from the church's perspective, so midwives had to be careful. They had to swear oaths that they wouldn't perform abortions or provide contraceptives. They had to attend church regularly, prove their piety, avoid any suggestion of witchcraft. And yet, when births went wrong, midwives were sometimes blamed. If a noble woman died in childbirth, the midwife might be accused of incompetence or even witchcraft. Some midwives were punished, imprisoned, or executed for failing to save a patient. It was deeply unfair. They were working with no real knowledge, no proper tools, no support, and when things went wrong through no fault of their own, they were scapegoated. Good midwives were valued in communities. Women would request specific midwives known for their skill. These midwives might attend dozens or even hundreds of births in their careers. They'd see every possible complication. They'd develop a sense for when something was going wrong. They couldn't always fix it, but they could recognize it. And sometimes just having an experienced, calm presence in the room helped. The midwife had seen this before. She knew what to try. She could reassure the mother even if the outcome was uncertain. But even the best midwives had limits. They couldn't perform surgery. They couldn't stop hemorrhaging beyond pressing on the abdomen or packing the vagina with cloth. They couldn't treat infections. They couldn't save a baby that was stuck in a position that made vaginal delivery impossible. They did their best with what they had, and what they had was almost nothing. Some midwives carried the trauma of their work. They'd see women die. They'd see babies die. They'd face angry families who blamed them. They'd face their own feelings of helplessness and failure. Some midwives developed what we'd now call PTSD or depression. Some quit after particularly traumatic births. Some kept going because their communities needed them. But the psychological toll was enormous. And midwives were almost always women. Men weren't allowed at births except in extraordinary circumstances. Childbirth was women's business. Men, even doctor-trained physicians, were excluded. This meant that the formal medical establishment, such as it was in medieval times, didn't study childbirth. Male physicians wrote medical texts that included sections on childbirth, but their knowledge was theoretical. They'd never attended a birth. They didn't understand the realities, and so the gap between theoretical medical knowledge and practical midwifery knowledge remained. Midwives had experience but no formal framework. Physicians had book learning but no practical skill, and women died in the gap between the two. In later centuries, male physicians would start to attend births, especially for wealthy women, and they'd bring instruments and techniques from surgery. Some of this would help. Some of it would make things worse because they still didn't understand infection. But in the medieval period, it was midwives, just midwives, doing their best with almost nothing, watching women die and carrying that burden forever. Finally, let's talk about the babies who survived but lost their mothers. Because maternal death didn't just end the mother's life, it shaped the lives of everyone left behind. And for a newborn baby or a young child, losing a mother in childbirth meant entering a world that was already difficult and becoming much harder. Newborn babies needed constant care, feeding every few hours, changing, comforting. In the modern world, a motherless newborn can be bottle-fed formula and raised by a single parent or adoptive family with relative success. In the medieval world, a motherless newborn was in immediate danger of death. Breast milk was the only option. And if the mother was dead, where would it come from? Wealthy families could hire wet nurses. We've touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing how common this was. Wet nursing was a profession. Women who had recently given birth and had abundant milk could nurse other babies for payment. Some wet nurses lived with the family. Others took the baby to their own homes. The quality of wet nursing varied wildly. Some wet nurses genuinely cared for the babies they fed. They bonded with them, treated them well, gave them the attention and affection they needed. Other wet nurses saw it purely as business. They'd feed the baby but provide no emotional care. Some wet nurses were nursing multiple babies at once, their own plus several others, and none of the babies got enough milk or attention. And there were risks. A wet nurse might have diseases that could be transmitted through breast milk or close contact. She might not follow basic hygiene. Her own health might be poor. If she became pregnant again, her milk might dry up, leaving the baby she was nursing in sudden crisis. But for wealthy families, wet nurses were the only option, and most babies survived. The system worked more or less if you had money. For poor families, the situation was desperate. You couldn't afford to hire a wet nurse, so you begged. You asked relatives, neighbours, anyone who was currently nursing and might take pity. Some women would agree to nurse another baby out of charity or community obligation, but it was a huge ask. Nursing takes calories, it takes time, it takes emotional energy. A woman with her own baby and her own struggles might not have enough for another child. If no nursing woman could be found, families tried alternatives. Animal milk, as mentioned. Pap, a mixture of bread soaked in water or milk, mashed and fed to the baby. Sometimes babies survived on these substitutes. Often they didn't. They'd develop malnutrition. Their growth would stall. They'd be weak and susceptible to disease. They might survive, but with developmental delays or health problems that would affect them for life. Some fathers, overwhelmed and unable to care for a newborn, would give the baby to a monastery or convent. Oblation, it was called. Giving a child to the church. The child would be raised in the religious community and expected to become a monk or nun when old enough, It solved the immediate problem. The baby would be fed, would survive. But it meant giving up your child. Some fathers saw it as the only option, a way to honour the dead mother by ensuring the child lived, even if it meant never raising that child yourself. Other children, slightly older, also suffered when their mothers died. A 4-year-old or 6-year-old who loses their mother doesn't fully understand death. They know their mother is gone. They might have seen her sick, seen her die, but they don't grasp the permanence. They keep asking when she's coming back, and the adults, grieving and overwhelmed, might not have the patience or understanding to explain gently. Children were told to be quiet, to stop crying, to accept God's will. Their grief was dismissed or punished, and then a stepmother would arrive. Sometimes she'd be kind, sometimes not. Children, especially young children, often resented the stepmother. She wasn't their real mother. She didn't love them the same way, and in many cases that resentment was justified. Stepmothers often favoured their own biological children. Resources were limited. Food, clothing, attention, all had to be divided. And it was natural, though cruel, for a woman to prioritise her own children over stepchildren. Some stepchildren were treated as servants in their own homes, made to work harder, eat less, receive harsher punishments. The fairy tales of Cinderella and Snow White with their wicked stepmothers resonated because they reflected a real pattern. Not every stepmother was wicked, but enough were that the trope became embedded in culture. Children who lost their mothers also lost their primary caregiver and emotional support. In medieval families, fathers were often distant figures. They worked long hours. They weren't expected to nurture or comfort. That was the mother's role. When the mother died, children lost the one person who was focused on their well-being, and they felt that loss deeply, even if they couldn't articulate it. Some children who lost their mothers young grew up with a haunted quality. They'd heard stories about her, seen her grave, but they had no real memories, just an absence, a hole where a mother should have been. And that shaped their development, their sense of security, their ability to trust and attach. And for older children, particularly daughters, losing a mother meant losing the person who would teach them about being a woman, about marriage, about running a household, about childbirth. Daughters learned from their mothers. When the mother died, that knowledge transmission stopped. Stepmothers might teach, but the relationship was different. The trust wasn't there. So girls entered marriage and motherhood themselves less prepared, more fearful, because their own mother hadn't been there to guide them. The intergenerational trauma was real. A girl whose mother died in childbirth would live in fear of the same fate. Statistics suggested she had reason to fear. And when her own time came, when she herself became pregnant, the terror would be overwhelming. She'd remember her mother, remember the stories, and wonder if this was how her own story would end. And here's the cruelest part. Despite all of this, despite the death, the trauma, the grief, the suffering, society didn't change. It didn't look at the thousands of women dying and think maybe we should do something different. Maybe we should study anatomy. Maybe we should prioritize women's survival. Instead, it shrugged. This was normal, expected, God's will. Women were meant to suffer in childbirth. It said so in the Bible, and so nothing changed. Mothers kept dying, children kept losing mothers, families kept grieving, and the cycle continued for centuries. It wasn't until the modern era, until germ theory was discovered, until antibiotics were developed, until surgical techniques improved and women's health became a medical priority, that maternal mortality finally began to drop. And even then, it took decades. The legacy of those medieval deaths, that medieval acceptance of women dying in childbirth, lingered. In some parts of the world, it still lingers today where access to medical care is limited. But in medieval Europe, there was no hope of change, just acceptance. Just the knowledge that if you were a woman, pregnancy was the most dangerous thing you'd ever do. More dangerous than plague, than famine, than war. And you'd do it anyway, again and again, because you had no choice. So tonight, As you drift off to sleep in a world where childbirth is safer than it's ever been in human history, maybe take a moment to remember those medieval women. The ones who died in agony. The ones who survived but buried their children. The ones who lived with the trauma and the fear and the damaged bodies. They didn't have a choice, but they faced it anyway. And that takes a kind of courage that's hard to even comprehend. Sleep well and be grateful.